The ordinary day took an unexpected turn when Sarah, a hardworking waitress, realized her customer was none other than Barron Trump. She hadn't expected to serve someone so well known, let alone be handed a note that would completely change her day and her life. What could possibly be written on that slip of paper that brought tears to her eyes? Tune in as we uncover the truth behind the note that left Sarah speechless and turned Barron into a national hero. A morning that changed everything. This particular morning, the sun peeked through the cafe's large windows, casting a warm glow over the neatly arranged tables. The usual hum of chatter filled the air, punctuated by the hiss of the espresso machine. Sarah moved through the room with ease, her warm smile brightening the day for every customer she served. To anyone watching, she seemed like the picture of resilience, but beneath her cheerful facade, Sarah carried a weight that few could see. Before we delve into this, it's clear that what Sarah found on that note wasn't just surprising, it was far more emotional than anyone could have imagined, and this won't be the only moment that will leave you speechless. Her shift had started at 6 in the morning, as it always did. The cafe opened early, catering to the early birds and office workers who streamed in before the city truly woke up. Sarah knew the regulars by name, their orders committed to memory. There was Mr. Thompson, who liked his coffee black with a single sugar, and Emily, a college student who always ordered the same caramel latte. They were part of her routine, a steady rhythm in her otherwise uncertain life. But as the morning rush subsided and the cafe's pace slowed, Sarah found herself gazing out the window, lost in thought. She dreamed of something more, a life beyond the cafe's walls, where she could finally breathe without the constant pressure of overdue bills and endless shifts. Her passion for baking was her escape, a world where she could create beautiful things and share them with others. But dreams didn't pay the rent, and so she worked tirelessly, hoping that one day her hard work would pay off. Then, just as she was about to clear a table near the window, the bell above the door chimed. Sarah turned, her practiced smile ready for the next customer. But what she saw made her pause. A tall young man walked in, flanked by two older men in suits. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his posture straight, his steps measured. His presence commanded attention, but he didn't seem to seek it. The room seemed to still for a moment as the group made their way to a corner table. Sarah's co-workers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the young man. But Sarah, ever the professional, approached their table with her usual warmth. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the curiosity bubbling inside her. She handed them menus, her mind racing. Who was he, and why did he feel so familiar? As she returned to the counter to prepare their drinks, snippets of conversation reached her ears. The other waitstaff were abuzz, speculating about the strange customer. "He looks so much like," one of them whispered, their voice trailing off. Sarah frowned, glancing back at the table. There was no denying the resemblance now that she looked closer. The sharp jawline, the striking eyes, the air of quiet authority. Could it really be him? But why would someone like him be here, in this modest little cafe? It didn't make sense. Sarah brushed the thought aside, focusing on her work. She had a job to do, and whoever he was just another customer, or so she told herself. As she approached their table again with their drinks, her hands steady despite the growing tension, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary day. The young man thanked her politely, his voice calm and measured. His companions barely spoke, their eyes scanning the room with practiced vigilance. Sarah noticed the subtle details, the way they positioned themselves to keep an eye on the entrance, the discreet earpieces tucked into their ears. It was clear they weren't just friends or colleagues. There was an air of quiet efficiency about them, a sense of purpose that set them apart from the usual crowd. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself glancing toward the corner table more often than she meant to. The young man's presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone in the room without him even trying. But he seemed unfazed by the stares, his focus entirely on the conversation at his table. Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had brought him here. Was it a chance visit, or was there something more to it? By the time they finished their meal, the cafe had begun to fill up again, the lull between breakfast and lunch giving way to a new wave of customers. Sarah was busy juggling orders, but she kept an eye on the corner table. As she cleared their plates and handed them the check, the young man offered her a small smile, his expression kind but reserved. "Thank you for your service," he said simply, his voice low but sincere. Sarah nodded, her usual cheerful demeanor masking the mix of emotions swirling inside her. She turned to walk away, but something made her glance back as they prepared to leave. That's when she noticed it, a folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of the check. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. What could it be? Before she could open it, the bell above the door chimed again, and the group was gone, their departure as quiet as their arrival. Sarah stood there for a moment, the note in her hand, the noise of the busy cafe fading into the background. She unfolded the paper slowly, her eyes scanning the words written in neat, precise handwriting. And as she read the note, her breath caught in her throat. Tears welled up in her eyes and she clutched the paper tightly, her mind racing. The shift carried on, but Sarah couldn't ignore the lingering thoughts about the young man who had quietly taken over her morning. His presence wasn't loud or imposing, yet it left an undeniable mark. She found herself replaying every detail, his poised movements, the calm intensity in his eyes, and the polite way he had spoken. There was something unspoken in his demeanor that made her feel both curious and uneasy, a feeling that stayed with her long after he left. As the hours stretched on, she tried to shake it off, focusing on her tasks and the stream of customers. It wasn't until her break that Sarah let herself breathe. Sitting in the small staff room at the back of the cafe, she pulled out the note again. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, even though she had already read its contents. The words were simple, but they carried a weight she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't a typical thank you note or even a compliment. Instead, it read like a message, meant just for her, cryptic, almost philosophical. Her mind wandered back to the moment he had handed her the check. His demeanor had been kind but distant, as though he knew something she didn't. And then there were his companions, who had been so quietly vigilant. Their presence felt more than seen. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the entire encounter had been deliberate, like she had been chosen for some reason she didn't yet understand. As her break ended, Sarah returned to the cafe floor with a renewed sense of awareness. She scanned the room, half expecting to see him again, though she knew it was unlikely. The cafe was busier now, the lunch rush bringing in a mix of regulars and newcomers, but no one carried the same air of quiet authority. Still, the memory of his visit lingered, making her hyper-aware of every detail around her. She noticed things she hadn't before, the way light streamed through the windows at a particular angle, the hum of conversations blending into a rhythmic buzz, the slight unease that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't long before she realized the other staff was still talking about him. Snippets of their whispers reached her as she moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and taking orders. "Did you see the way he carried himself?" one of them said. Another mentioned his resemblance to someone they had seen on the news. Sarah tuned them out, not wanting to feed into the speculation. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if they were right. Could he really have been who they thought he was? As the day wore on, Sarah's thoughts became harder to suppress. She found herself questioning everything about the encounter. Why had he chosen this cafe? Why had he left that note? And why did she feel like it was meant for her specifically? The questions gnawed at her, creating a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of connection. She couldn't explain it, but something about him felt familiar, as though their paths had crossed before, even though she knew they hadn't. By the time her shift ended, Sarah was exhausted, but her mind was still racing. She replayed the morning's events over and over, trying to make sense of them. The note remained tucked in her pocket, a constant reminder of the encounter. As she walked home, the city's noise faded into the background, her thoughts drowning out everything else. The streets were bustling with activity, but she felt strangely detached, as though she were moving through a dream. At home, Sarah finally allowed herself to fully process the day. She sat at her small kitchen table, the note in front of her, its words staring back at her like a challenge. She couldn't shake the feeling that it held some deeper meaning, something she was meant to understand. But no matter how many times she read it, the message remained just out of reach. It was both frustrating and intriguing, pulling her into a web of questions she couldn't untangle. Over the next few days, Sarah tried to return to her normal routine, but the encounter continued to haunt her. Every time she entered the cafe, she found herself looking toward the corner table where he had sat. She couldn't help but wonder if he would return, though she knew it was unlikely. Still, the possibility lingered in the back of her mind, a small flicker of hope she couldn't extinguish. Her co-workers noticed her distraction, but Sarah brushed off their concerns, insisting she was fine. In truth, she wasn't sure how she felt. The encounter had stirred something inside her, a mix of curiosity, unease, and a strange sense of purpose. She found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit, replaying every detail of their brief interaction. The way he had looked at her, the tone of his voice, the subtle kindness in his demeanor, it all felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in herself. She became more observant, more attuned to the world around her. She started paying closer attention to the people she served, wondering about their stories and what had brought them to the cafe. She found herself looking for signs, clues that might help her make sense of the encounter. It was as though the young man had awakened something inside her, a curiosity she hadn't realized she possessed. One evening, as she was closing up the cafe, Sarah found herself standing by the corner table, staring at the empty seat where he had sat. She couldn't explain it, but she felt drawn to the spot, as though it held some hidden significance. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the note, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. The words still held their power, their meaning just out of reach. But as she stood there, a sense of clarity began to form. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: the encounter had changed her. Sarah left the cafe that night with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to find out. The young man had come and gone, leaving behind more questions than answers. But in doing so, he had ignited something in Sarah, a spark that refused to fade. She didn't know where the path would lead, but she was ready to follow it, wherever it might take her. As Sarah held the note in her hands, an uneasy feeling stayed with her, leaving her unsure of what to think, but unable to ignore it. A note that spoke to her heart. The end of her shift was marked by the usual rush to clean up, the clatter of dishes being stacked and wiped, and the low hum of her co-workers chatting about their evening plans. Sarah moved through the motions on autopilot, her body tired, but her mind still restless. The strange encounter earlier in the day lingered like a faint echo, refusing to be drowned out by the noise of her routine. As she cleared the last table near the corner where he had sat, she noticed something tucked under the edge of the check holder. Her breath hitched. It was a folded note, the kind that begged to be opened immediately, but also filled her with an inexplicable sense of apprehension. The handwriting on the outside was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably personal. Her name was written on it, clear as day. A chill ran through her as she realized this wasn't a forgotten napkin doodle or a careless scribble. This was meant for her, left intentionally, deliberately. Hands trembling, Sarah unfolded the note. The paper felt heavy in her fingers, its texture suggesting it wasn't something hastily torn from a notebook. Her eyes scanned the words, each line pulling her deeper into a swirl of emotions she couldn't quite name. The message was brief but striking. It referenced a moment from her childhood, a memory so private she couldn't fathom how anyone else could know about it. It was a summer afternoon, years ago, when she had stood in her backyard watching a butterfly land on her outstretched hand. The note described it perfectly, down to the yellow and black pattern on the butterfly's wings. Sarah's heart raced as she reread the words, her mind grasping for an explanation. Who was this person? How did they know about that memory? It wasn't the kind of thing she had ever shared, not even with her closest friends or family. The note didn't offer any clues about its author, only signing off with the simple phrase, "You're stronger than you think." She sank into the nearest chair, the note clutched tightly in her hand. Her thoughts churned, a chaotic mix of fear, disbelief, and something else she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the words that unsettled her, it was the tone, the way they seemed to reach into her soul and pull at something raw and unspoken. The memory itself wasn't extraordinary, it was just a fleeting moment from her past. But the fact that someone had chosen to remind her of it in such a deliberate way felt deeply significant. Tears welled up in her eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. She wasn't sure if they were born of fear or gratitude, or perhaps a combination of both. The note felt like a lifeline thrown to her just as she was beginning to sink beneath the weight of her struggles. It was as though someone had seen her, truly seen her, and decided to reach out in the most unexpected way. As she sat there, the bustling sounds of the cafe faded into the background. The clinking of dishes, the murmur of voices, the faint strains of music from the radio, all of it blurred into a distant hum. Her world narrowed to the words on the page and the flood of emotions they had unleashed. She felt exposed, as though the note had peeled back the layers of her carefully constructed facade and laid bare the vulnerable, aching part of her she rarely let anyone see. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Sarah finished her task mechanically, her mind preoccupied with the note and its implications. She couldn't bring herself to share it with anyone, not even her co-workers who had been buzzing about the strange customer all day. It felt too personal, too intimate to explain. Besides, she wasn't sure she even wanted answers. Part of her feared that digging too deeply would ruin the fragile sense of wonder the note had given her. At home, Sarah placed the note on her small kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, drawing her in and pushing her away at the same time. She wanted to frame it, to keep it as a reminder that someone, somewhere believed in her, but she also wanted to burn it, to erase the confusion and vulnerability it had stirred within her. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the memory of that summer afternoon played in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. She could almost feel the butterfly's delicate wings brushing against her skin, hear the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. It was a memory she had treasured, but had long since tucked away, buried beneath the responsibilities and worries of adulthood. Now, it had been brought back to the surface, accompanied by a message that felt both comforting and unsettling. In the days that followed, Sarah carried the note with her everywhere. She slipped it into her pocket when she left for work, keeping it close like a talisman. Its presence was a constant reminder of the encounter, a question she couldn't solve but couldn't let go of either. She found herself looking at the world differently, noticing details she had previously overlooked. The way sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of laughter from a nearby playground, the kindness in a stranger's smile. Everything felt sharper, more significant. But along with this newfound awareness came a sense of unease. The note had opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. It had stirred questions she didn't know how to answer about herself, her past, and the person who had written it. She found herself retracing her steps, replaying every moment of the encounter with the young man in the cafe. Had there been something she had missed? A clue, a sign, anything that might explain what had happened? Despite her best efforts, Sarah couldn't make sense of it. The note remained a problem, its meaning elusive and its author unknown. But even as it confounded her, it also gave her something she hadn't realized she was missing: a sense of possibility. The idea that there might be more to her life than the daily grind, that someone out there saw her potential even when she couldn't see it herself. It was a small thing, just a few words on a piece of paper, but it had shifted something inside her. By the end of the week, Sarah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and renewal. The note had consumed her thoughts, but it had also ignited a spark she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. The world seemed a little bigger, a little brighter, and her place in it a little more uncertain, but also a little more full of promise. The note had unearthed something Sarah had long buried. As she sat in the quiet of her apartment, its words felt like a bridge to a part of her life she had spent years trying to forget. The phrases lingered in her mind, bringing with them memories she had worked so hard to lock away. Each word seemed carefully chosen, not only to comfort her, but also to stir the depths of her heart, to pull her back to a time when life had felt both fuller and more fragile. Sarah's childhood had been marked by moments of simple joy, but those moments were overshadowed by a tragedy that reshaped her family and her sense of self. Growing up, she had been the kind of child who loved to explore. Summers were spent in the backyard of their modest home, catching fireflies and watching clouds drift across the sky. Her parents, though not wealthy, made every effort to fill their small world with love. It was during one of those carefree summers that the butterfly moment had occurred, a seemingly insignificant memory that the note had now brought back with startling clarity. But that golden time had been shattered when Sarah was 9 years old. Her older brother, Liam, was her hero, always there to tease her, protect her, and share his endless curiosity about the world. He had a way of making everything feel like an adventure, even the ordinary days. One winter afternoon, while playing on the frozen lake near their home, Liam had ventured too far out. The ice, thin and deceptive, gave way beneath him. Sarah had been there, watching in horror, her screams echoing across the frozen expanse. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Liam was gone, and so was the lightness that had once filled her world. Her family was never the same. Her parents, consumed by grief, drifted apart. Her mother threw herself into work, while her father withdrew into silence. Sarah, left to navigate her own pain, learned to mask her emotions, to carry her sorrow quietly. She grew up feeling as though she had to be strong for everyone else, a responsibility that weighed on her even as she struggled to find her own footing. The memory of that day on the lake became a wound she couldn't heal, a scar she hid but never forgot. The note's mention of the butterfly brought her back to a summer just before Liam's death. They had been playing outside when a butterfly landed on her hand, its delicate wings brushing her skin. Liam had laughed, calling her the butterfly whisperer, a nickname that stuck for weeks. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered happiness, one she had clung to in the years that followed. To see it referenced in the note felt almost intrusive, as though someone had reached into the most private corner of her heart. But it wasn't just the memory of the butterfly that unsettled her. The note included a phrase that her father had often said before Liam's death: "You're stronger than you think." It was something he would tell her whenever she doubted herself, a quiet reassurance that she could face whatever challenges came her way. After Liam's death, her father had stopped saying it. The words, once a source of comfort, became a painful reminder of what they had lost. Now, seeing those words written in someone else's hand felt like a jolt. How could this stranger know about her father's saying? How could he have known about the butterfly moment? The questions swirled in her mind, creating a mix of emotions she couldn't untangle. The note felt both deeply personal and unsettlingly strange, as though it had been written by someone who knew her better than she knew herself. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself revisiting her past with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. The memories came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. She remembered the way her mother's laughter used to fill their small kitchen, the way her father's eyes lit up when he told one of his corny jokes. She remembered the sound of Liam's voice, the way he always seemed to know exactly what to say to make her feel better. And she remembered the emptiness that followed his death, the silence that settled over their home like a heavy blanket. The note had stirred something in her, a longing to reconnect with the parts of herself she had pushed away. It was as though someone had turned on a light in a room she had kept locked for years, forcing her to confront what lay inside. The pain was raw, but so was the hope, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to heal. Sarah began to see connections she hadn't noticed before, threads that tied her past to the present in ways that felt almost deliberate. The phrases in the note, the memory of the butterfly, even the timing of the encounter with the strange young man, it all felt too precise to be a coincidence. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was leading her somewhere, that there was a purpose to it all. Her thoughts often returned to the young man who had left the note. She couldn't remember his face in detail, only the sense of calm and purpose he exuded. His presence had been magnetic, drawing her in without her fully understanding why. And though she had initially dismissed the whispers of her co-workers, she now found herself wondering if they had been right. Could he really have been Barron Trump? And if so, what could possibly have compelled him to reach out to her in such a personal way? The questions gnawed at her, but they also gave her a sense of direction she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Liam's death, Sarah felt a spark of curiosity about her own life, a desire to uncover the truths she had buried. The note had opened a door, and though she didn't know where it led, she was determined to find out. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself drawn to places and memories she had avoided for years. She visited the lake where Liam had died, standing at the edge of the frozen water and letting the weight of her grief wash over her. She dug out old photo albums, flipping through the pages with a mix of sadness and nostalgia. She even began baking again, experimenting with recipes the way she used to when she dreamed of opening her own bakery. Through it all, the note remained a constant presence, a reminder of the encounter that had set this path in motion. Its words echoed in her mind, pushing her to confront the parts of herself she had long ignored. And though she still didn't have all the answers, she began to feel a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The pain was still there, but so was the hope, a fragile, flickering light that refused to be extinguished. Sarah didn't know what lay ahead, but she felt ready to face it. Her past and her present were beginning to intertwine in ways she couldn't have predicted, creating a path that was both terrifying and exhilarating. And as she took her first tentative steps forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next few days were filled with thoughts she couldn't push away, and each moment seemed to bring her closer to something she didn't fully understand. The man who left her wondering. The note lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't stop humming. It wasn't just the words themselves that unsettled her, but the way they seemed to fit perfectly into the cracks of her life, filling spaces she hadn't even realized were empty. Each time she tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, a nagging sense of purpose crept back in, pulling her into the orbit of the unanswered questions surrounding the encounter. Should she pursue the mystery, or was it better to leave it as a fleeting moment of serendipity, a small gift from the universe meant to inspire rather than unravel? At first, She tried to convince herself that letting it go was the best choice. After all, her life was complicated enough without diving into something she couldn't explain. The days were long, her bills piled up relentlessly, and her dreams of a better future felt like they were slipping further out of reach. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to focus on her routine, the note's impact lingered, reshaping the way she saw the world. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't just curious about the note or the man who left it. She was curious about herself. What was it about her that had drawn his attention? Why had he chosen to leave her such a personal and evocative message? Her decision to pursue answers came gradually, as if her mind needed time to prepare for the path ahead. She began by replaying the encounter in her head, dissecting every detail for clues she might have missed. The way he had carried himself, confident but not arrogant, seemed deliberate, as though every movement was carefully measured. His expression, calm and reserved, had carried an air of quiet authority. And then there was the peculiar pin he wore, a small emblem that had caught her eye but hadn't registered as significant at the time. Now it felt like a breadcrumb, left behind to guide her towards something she couldn't yet see. The pin was circular, with an intricate design etched into its surface. She couldn't recall the details exactly, but she remembered the faint glint of gold and the sense that it symbolized something important. It wasn't the kind of accessory one wore casually. It had meaning, though what that meaning was remained a question. She wondered if it was connected to a school, an organization, or perhaps even a family crest. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the pin was a key to understanding who he was and why he had reached out to her. As she continued to piece together the fragments of her memory, she found herself drawn to her co-workers, hoping their chatter might reveal something she had overlooked. The day after the encounter, the cafe buzzed with speculation about the strange customer. Most of the staff seemed content to dismiss it as a random brush with celebrity, but a few lingered on the details, their curiosity mirroring her own. One of them mentioned the bodyguards, noting how they had positioned themselves strategically around the room, their vigilance subtle but unmistakable. Another pointed out how unusually polite the young man had been, a trait they found surprising given the company he might keep. It wasn't much to go on, but it gave her a starting point. If her co-workers' suspicions were correct, and the man was indeed Barron Trump, then his presence in the cafe couldn't have been random. People like him didn't just wander into small, unassuming coffee shops without a reason. The question was, what was that reason? And why had he left her a note that seemed to reach into the deepest corners of her life? Driven by these questions, she turned to the internet, combing through articles and images in search of anything that might help her make sense of the encounter. Her research led her down countless rabbit holes, from profiles of Barron Trump to analyses of philanthropic efforts tied to his family. She discovered that despite his reserved public persona, he had been quietly involved in several charitable initiatives over the years. Some of these efforts focused on education and mentorship, which struck a chord with her given the deeply personal nature of the note he had left. One particular article caught her attention. It detailed a program aimed at identifying and supporting individuals with untapped potential, providing them with the resources and opportunities they needed to thrive. The program's mission was to empower people who had faced significant challenges, helping them turn their struggles into strengths. She couldn't shake the feeling that this initiative was somehow connected to her encounter, though she had no proof to back up her suspicion. As she delved deeper, patterns she hadn't seen before began to emerge. The phrases in the note, the way the encounter had unfolded, even the timing of it all. It felt orchestrated, as though someone had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to intervene. It was an unsettling thought, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, a problem she was determined to solve. Her search for answers extended beyond the digital realm. She began to pay closer attention to her surroundings, looking for signs that might point her in the right direction. She noticed people more acutely, their expressions, their body language, the details of their clothing. It was as though the encounter had sharpened her perception, making her hyper-aware of the world around her. She found herself wondering about the stories of the strangers she served at the cafe, imagining the struggles and triumphs that had brought them to her table. But even as she pursued these threads, she couldn't ignore the emotional toll the search was taking on her. The note had stirred up memories she had spent years trying to suppress, forcing her to confront the pain of her past in ways she hadn't anticipated. There were nights when she lay awake, her mind racing with questions and doubts. What if she was wrong? What if the note was nothing more than a random act of kindness, its significance magnified by her own longing for meaning? Despite these doubts, she couldn't bring herself to let go of the search. Each step she took, each clue she uncovered, brought her closer to understanding not just the note, but herself. She began to see her life in a new light, recognizing the resilience that had carried her through her darkest moments. The words, "You're stronger than you think," echoed in her mind, reminding her that even in the face of uncertainty, she had the strength to keep going. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and notes, she found herself reflecting on the path so far. She thought about the young man who had left the note, the quiet intensity of his presence, and the kindness in his actions. She thought about the memories the note had unearthed, the way they had forced her to confront the parts of herself she had tried to ignore. And she thought about the future, the path that lay ahead, still shrouded in uncertainty, but illuminated by a flicker of hope. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was beginning to piece together the puzzle. The note, the encounter, the connection she had uncovered, it all felt like the beginning of something bigger, a path that would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she felt ready to face it, armed with the strength she hadn't realized she possessed, and the hope that had been reignited within her. Her week unfolded in a haze of routine and restless thoughts, the strange note and her search for meaning never far from her mind. She had started to adjust to the questions swirling around her life, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. A plain white envelope appeared in her mailbox one morning, standing out starkly among the usual stack of bills and advertisements. Her name was printed neatly on the front, and the paper felt heavier than usual, as though its contents carried a weight beyond its physical form. She opened it carefully, her heart racing as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief and precise, instructing her to be at the lounge of an upscale hotel downtown at 7 o'clock that evening. No sender was indicated, but there was little doubt in her mind who had sent it. The handwriting, the careful choice of words, it all carried the same deliberate energy as the note she had found under the check. It felt personal, yet distant, a beckoning from a world she didn't yet understand. The rest of the day was a blur. She struggled to focus at work, her thoughts consumed by the invitation. Anxiety and curiosity wrestled for control of her emotions, each thought pulling her in a different direction. What if this was a mistake? What if the meeting wasn't safe? But alongside the fear came a sense of purpose, a conviction that this encounter was a step she needed to take. The note had opened a door, and now the invitation felt like a hand reaching through, urging her to walk through it. As the evening approached, she stood in front of her closet, staring at her modest collection of clothes. She wanted to look presentable without overdoing it, to strike a balance between professionalism and authenticity. In the end, she settled on a simple yet elegant dress, pairing it with a coat that had seen better days but still carried a certain charm. Her reflection in the mirror was both familiar and foreign, a version of herself she hadn't seen in years, determined, hopeful, and ready to step into the unknown. The cab ride to the hotel felt like a lifetime. The city lights blurred past the window as her thoughts raced. She tried to imagine what awaited her, but every scenario she conjured felt incomplete, as though the truth lay just out of reach. The invitation had been so vague, leaving her with nothing but questions. Who would she meet? What would they say? And most importantly, why had this all begun? The hotel was as grand as she had imagined, its opulent lobby bustling with guests and staff. She felt out of place among the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but she reminded herself that she had every right to be there. The invitation had been addressed to her after all. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping into the lounge. The space was elegant and understated, with soft lighting and plush seating arranged in intimate clusters. A server approached her with a polite smile, but she waved him off, her focus on scanning the room. It didn't take long for her to notice the man who was clearly waiting for her. He was seated at a corner table, his posture relaxed but deliberate, a quiet confidence radiating from him. Though he wasn't Barron, his presence carried a similar energy, measured, purposeful, and strange. She hesitated for a moment before approaching. The man stood as she neared, extending a hand in greeting. His expression was calm and unreadable, his demeanor professional yet inviting. He introduced himself as a member of Barron's team, though he didn't elaborate on his exact role. Instead, he gestured for her to sit, his movements deliberate and precise, as though every action carried meaning. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation. Here she was, sitting in a luxury hotel lounge, meeting someone connected to one of the most strange encounters of her life. But as the man began to speak, her anxiety gave way to a quiet curiosity. His words were carefully chosen, each one resonating with a sense of purpose. He spoke of connections, how they could shape lives, bridge gaps, and bring people together in unexpected ways. She listened intently, her mind racing to make sense of what she was hearing. The man didn't offer concrete answers, but his words felt like pieces of a larger problem. He mentioned fate, describing it not as a predetermined path, but as a series of moments that could guide people toward their true potential. He spoke of resilience, of the strength it took to face life's challenges and emerge stronger on the other side. And though he didn't mention the note directly, his words carried echoes of his message, reinforcing the themes of strength and possibility that had resonated so deeply with her. The conversation felt both personal and distant, as though the man knew more about her than he let on, but was careful not to overstep. He didn't provide details about why Barron had chosen to reach out to her or what the ultimate purpose of the encounter was. Instead, he left her with a sense of wonder, a feeling that there was more to this story than she could yet understand. His presence felt like a bridge, connecting her to something larger than herself, something she couldn't yet define. As the meeting came to an end, the man handed her a small envelope. He didn't explain its contents, simply instructing her to open it when she felt ready. His tone was calm and reassuring, his expression carrying a hint of encouragement. With that, he stood, thanked her for her time, and left the lounge, his departure as quiet and deliberate as his arrival. She sat there for a long time, the envelope resting in her lap. The lounge buzzed softly around her, the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses blending into a gentle hum. She felt both grounded and untethered, as though the meeting had shifted something within her, but left her unsure of what to do next. The envelope felt heavy in her hands, its weight both physical and symbolic. When she finally opened it later that night, she found a single piece of paper inside. The message was brief, written in the same precise handwriting as the note she had found in the cafe. It included a date, a time, and a location, with no further explanation. The simplicity of it was both frustrating and intriguing, leaving her with more questions than answers. But as she stared at the paper, a sense of determination began to take hold. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she had to see it through. Walking toward the large estate, Sarah felt the weight of what was ahead, knowing that whatever she learned there could change everything. A meeting that changed her life. Sarah's days had turned into a mix of anticipation and trepidation after receiving the strange invitation and envelope. The carefully planned meeting had left her with a new date, time, and location, and while the questions in her mind multiplied, the answers remained elusive. The location written on the slip of paper led her to a grand private estate on the outskirts of the city. Its sprawling gardens and towering gates spoke of a wealth and legacy far removed from her own modest life. As she approached the estate, she could feel the weight of the moment building within her, like the calm before a storm. The estate's interior was as grand as its exterior, filled with ornate details and an air of quiet power. Sarah was led through a series of hallways by a composed and discreet attendant who seemed to know exactly who she was and why she was there. The space felt labyrinthine, designed to make her feel both awed and insignificant. She was ushered into a sunlit sitting room where the young man who had started this whirlwind waited for her. Barron Trump was seated calmly, his posture impeccable, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sarah felt a wave of nervousness wash over her, but she quickly steeled herself. The months of confusion, emotional upheaval, and self-reflection had prepared her for this moment. She was ready to hear the truth, no matter how complex or unexpected it might be. As she sat across from him, her attention was drawn to the way the sunlight caught on the pin he wore, the same one she had noticed during their first encounter. Its intricate design seemed almost alive in the shifting light, a small but potent symbol of everything she didn't yet understand. Barron's presence was quiet but commanding, and as he began to speak, the room seemed to shrink around him. His voice was measured, each word deliberate, as though he had spent a great deal of time deciding how best to convey what he was about to say. He spoke first of the note, explaining why he had left it and why it had been addressed to her specifically. His family, he explained, had long held an interest in uncovering and nurturing untapped potential in those who had faced great challenges. Sarah, it seemed, had come to their attention through a network of philanthropic efforts aimed at helping individuals rebuild their lives. But his interest in her wasn't solely professional. Barron revealed that he knew of Sarah's past not through abstract reports or profiles, but through a personal connection that had long been hidden from her. He spoke of a moment in time, years before Sarah was born, when her father had unknowingly crossed paths with Barron's family. It had been an act of kindness on her father's part, one that had left a lasting impression. Her father, struggling but principled, had helped someone in Barron's family during a time of great need, expecting nothing in return. This connection, Barron explained, had remained a quiet but significant part of his family's history. They had often wondered about the man who had shown such generosity, and when they discovered Sarah's story, they felt compelled to reach out. The note, the meeting, and now this revelation were all part of an effort to honor that connection and to extend the same kindness that had once been shown to them. It was a gesture of gratitude, but also of belief in Sarah's potential, a belief that she had struggled to hold onto herself. Sarah listened in stunned silence as Barron recounted the details, his words filling in gaps she hadn't even realized existed. The revelation felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place, illuminating parts of her past that had always seemed disconnected. The butterfly moment, the phrase her father used to say, the note, everything suddenly made sense. The depth of the connection left her breathless, as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the weight of the truth settled over her. The emotions were overwhelming, a tidal wave of grief, gratitude, and relief crashing into her all at once. She thought of her father, of the struggles he had endured, and the values he had instilled in her despite everything. To know that his actions had not only mattered, but had left a legacy beyond anything she could have imagined was both humbling and uplifting. Her mind raced with memories of her childhood, moments that now carried new significance in light of what she had learned. She thought of the nights when her father would sit at the kitchen table, his face lined with worry, but his words always encouraging. She thought of the way he had taught her to find joy in small things, to believe in the goodness of others, even when life felt unbearably hard. And she thought of how, even in his absence, his influence had shaped the person she had become. Barron continued, his tone gentle but unwavering, as he described the philanthropic initiatives his family had created to honor the memory of acts like her father's. He explained that Sarah's resilience and determination had caught their attention, and they believed she was capable of achieving far more than she realized. The note, he said, was meant as a spark, a way to reignite her belief in herself and to remind her of the strength she carried within her. As the conversation drew to a close, Barron extended an opportunity to Sarah, one that left her simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. He invited her to participate in a program designed to support individuals like her, providing resources, mentorship, and a platform to pursue her dreams. It was an offer that could change the trajectory of her life, but it was also one that required her to confront her fears and step into a world she had never imagined herself a part of. Sarah's tears continued to flow as she processed the enormity of the moment. The pieces of her past, present, and future had converged in a way that felt almost too perfect to be real. She thought of the note, the invitation, the meeting, and now the revelation, all of it leading her to this crossroads. The path had been one of pain and uncertainty, but it had also been one of growth and self-discovery. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity, a belief that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As she left the estate that day, the weight of her emotions remained, but so did a newfound sense of purpose. The revelation had reshaped her understanding of herself and her place in the world, giving her the strength to face whatever came next. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah was ready to walk it, knowing that she carried with her the legacy of her father's kindness and the belief of those who had chosen to reach out to her. Whatever lay ahead, she was determined to honor the past, embrace the present, and step boldly into the future. Months later, Sarah's life was completely different, but she couldn't stop thinking about how one small act had created so much change, turning struggles into strength. Months had passed since that pivotal meeting, and Sarah's life now felt unrecognizable from the one she had known before. The weight of her struggles, once an ever-present shadow, had lightened. Barron's intervention had been more than an act of kindness. It had been a lifeline, pulling her from the depths of despair and setting her on a path toward hope and fulfillment. The program he had invited her to join became a cornerstone of her transformation, offering resources and mentorship that allowed her to finally pursue the dreams she had long kept hidden. Her mornings no longer began with the endless grind of serving coffee in the small cafe. Instead, they were filled with the warm, comforting scents of her own bakery. The small space she had dreamed of for years was now a reality, its walls painted in soft, inviting tones and its shelves lined with the fruits of her labor. Customers came not just for the pastries, but for the sense of community she had cultivated, a reflection of the kindness and generosity she had received. Each day felt like a celebration of resilience, proof that change was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. Sarah often thought back to the moment she found the note, the catalyst for everything that followed. It was strange to think how a single piece of paper had altered the course of her life, how a message from a stranger had reached into the deepest corners of her heart and pulled her forward. The memory of Barron's quiet confidence, his deliberate words, and the connection he had revealed lingered with her, a reminder of the unseen threads that weave people's lives together. But even as she embraced her new beginning, Sarah couldn't shake the sense of lingering mystery that surrounded those events. There were details that remained unclear, questions that might never be fully answered. The pin Barron had worn during their first meeting with its intricate design and symbolic weight, often came to mind. She had tried to research its origins, but the answers remained elusive, as though the truth was meant to stay just out of reach. It was a small reminder that not everything in life could be neatly explained, that some moments were meant to be accepted for the wonder they brought, rather than fully understood. Sarah had learned to live with that ambiguity, finding peace in the idea that some questions were simply part of the human experience. The unknown no longer felt threatening, but rather like a quiet assurance that life still held surprises. It was a perspective that colored everything she did, from the way she interacted with her customers to the way she approached her own challenges. She no longer felt the need to have all the answers. It was enough to trust in the connections that had brought her this far. Reflecting on her path, Sarah found herself marveling at the power of human connection, the kindness of strangers, the generosity of a young man who had seen something in her she hadn't seen in herself, and the legacy of her father's quiet heroism had all converged to create a story she could never have imagined. It was a story of resilience and redemption, of finding light in the darkest moments and turning pain into purpose. And it was a story that reminded her of the strength she carried within her, a strength she now shared with those around her. Her bakery became more than just a business. It became a haven for others who, like her, were searching for meaning and connection. She hired staff who had faced their own challenges, creating opportunities for them to rebuild their lives. She listened to their stories, offering encouragement and support, and in doing so, she found healing for herself. The act of giving back became a cornerstone of her new life, a way to honor the kindness she had received and to keep the cycle of generosity alive. As she stood behind the counter one quiet afternoon, watching the sunlight stream through the windows and dance across the floor, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. Her life was far from perfect, but it was full in a way she had never known before. The struggles she had faced had shaped her, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they had become stepping stones, markers of how far she had come and how much further she could go. And yet the question of it all still lingered. There were moments when she would catch herself wondering about Barron, about the forces that had brought him into her life and the choices that had led him to reach out. She knew she might never fully understand his motivations, but she had come to accept that some stories were meant to remain partially untold. The unanswered questions didn't diminish the impact of what had happened. If anything, they added a layer of depth and meaning that made her path all the more profound. In the quiet moments of her new life, Sarah often thought of her father. She imagined what he might say if he could see her now, if he could witness the life she had built and the person she had become. She hoped he would be proud, that he would see the ways his values had shaped her and the ways she had carried his legacy forward. His words, "You're stronger than you think," still echoed in her mind, a guiding mantra that had carried her through the darkest days and into the light. Was Barron Trump's note just a kind gesture, or does it reveal something deeper about his family? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.